The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Quit using my D20, you're going to use up all my good rolls.
And tonight, we're going to be talking about role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, and the difference between what's the so-called soft role-playing games and the so-called hard role-playing games. Yes, there are soft and hard role-playing games, and if you didn't know that, you're about to get schooled. And to help us school you, we've brought in our favorite teacher, Jack Ward.
Boom, chicka, wow, wow. Talking
It's not
about
that
soft
kind of school, man.
and hardcore role-playing.
It's not that kind of role-playing either. Jeez, man,
okay.
get your mind out of the gutter. Everyone's, as soon as people say hard and soft, people just their minds just go into the wrong place.
Of course. Well, thanks for
Well,
inviting me, by the way, before we go down this mad path.
All right, well, just don't go soft on us, okay?
I took pills for that.
That's awesome. All right, Don, why don't you tell us about the difference between soft tabletop role-playing games and hard tabletop role-playing games? And I'm assuming it doesn't just refer to the cover that's on them.
Yeah, it's true. We got to kind of find a different term, I think, because this is going to be problematic.
Although
Only if you guys are above the age of 5.
It's interesting, though, because I think you could argue that most hard-covered tabletop games are the hard rules, and the soft additions afterwards are additional soft rules. That not all the time, but you could find that there's a great deal of those originally would work, I would say.
Yeah, that's oddly prescient.
Sort of. I mean, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Would you guys prefer the term rules light and rules heavy instead? Would that work for your juvenile minds?
Yeah,
I'm sure we could make that dirty too. I don't know.
I'm pretty sure you probably can, yeah.
Well,
It's going to be one of those shows, folks.
Because all I can picture, there's a Family Guy episode with Peter and Lois engaging in role playing, and she comes out in a slinky outfit. I'm a naughty schoolgirl, and you see Peter in bed. Well, I'm a 15th level paladin with a vorpal sword of like sharpness, and she stops and goes, "Wait, Peter, the paladin can't use the vorpal sword. It's against the rules." Oh. Okay, then I'm a black guy, you know. So that's what keeps running through my head when you talk about role playing. Damn you, Family Guy! You've ruined something else for me.
It's quickly turning into the wrong kind of podcast.
Exactly. Well, apparently this is going to be our Sex and D&D episode after all.
Anyway,
there's an obscure joke for you. All right, so let's return to our focus. So, how about we discuss the difference between rules heavy and rules light role-playing games? How about that?
yeah, it's that I think works.
Because they basically are, right?
Yeah, because the hard soft thing is kind of borrowed from science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And I don't think it quite applies to role playing games, because what we're going to talk about is the mechanics.
Yes.
And not necessarily the content. And that's important because we've kind of danced around this before, because we've talked about designing a role-playing game.
Mm-hmm. With Jack.
And we hit on this, and we had a discussion about what's called a narrativist role-playing game, which is one that's more story-focused rather than event-focused.
Mm-hmm.
And you can have a narrativist game with super complicated rules, and you can have like a simulationist game with very light rules. And it's those specific mechanics we're kind of focusing in on.
Mm-hmm. So again, back to rules light versus rules heavy games.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty apt term for it, because it's that idea, I guess, in simplest terms, of how much math do I have to be able to do to play this thing.
Right. And, well, I think we should probably go back. So would you consider, going back to the original, would you consider early D&D rules heavy or rules light? Now, not AD&D, but D&D.
This kind of gets at the crux of why this is important. And what we're talking about here is kind of specific to tabletop role-playing games. Because computer games, the computer does all of this, so it's not something that comes up as often. And other forms of entertainment, because the vicarious participancy works different. It's a little different. But when you get to the first version of D&D, it's really a rules light kind of game.
I agree with that.
There's not a lot of mechanics to it at all, and the interesting thing is it probably should have been a rules heavy game.
Oh, they fixed that in a hurry, don't worry.
Yeah, they do, because what ends up happening is a lot of the game comes down to, and the dungeon master will figure it out. Oh, good, thanks, that's fantastic. But that was the spirit of the day. And,
do you think that was Dave Arneson that did that part of it? Because it always struck me that Gary Gygax was the real crunchy statistician who liked to have the tables, because he did a lot of the wargaming kind of chainmail stuff and that earlier on, right?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think a lot of it was just the spirit of the day. Because the last year or so I've had an obsession with the first edition, and I've tracked down a bunch of like magazines.
White box?
Yep.
Cool.
And a lot of the fanzines and that of the day, which you can surprisingly find online and that.
Cool.
There was this kind of do-it-yourself attitude, because the hobby was completely new. And the mechanics were pretty threadbare, just because this was all of the stuff that they kind of thought made the core of the game. They were sort of, the people producing it were making it up as they went along. That's why in the original book there's basically 3 different versions of the combat system.
Wow.
And then, yeah, everybody playing would just kind of throw things in. Like, it amazes me when you look at the random encounter tables for the original White Box game. Probably 80% of the monsters they reference aren't in any of the books.
Okay.
Yeah, they're mostly ripped off from other sources. So you can run into like Fremen or sandworms, and it was assumed at the time, because D&D kind of comes out of fandom. It's something that bubbles out of the burgeoning sci-fi fantasy fans of the day. And at that time, everybody was kind of into everything. So it was just assumed that you knew what that was, or if they referenced Barsoom, you knew what Barsoom was, because you'd read the John Carter stuff, and everybody was just kind of got up and rolling. There wasn't any concern for formalized rules. There wasn't concern for any kind of internal logic or consistency. It was just everybody had this great new thing that they were just playing with and doing whatever.
Right.
One of the things, though, that if I can add this in,
Go ahead.
What strikes me, though, Don, is I think that video games actually can have that kind of complexity, because I'll find that if certain things aren't hidden, like, for example, I was playing Fallout 4, and nothing's more frustrating for me than the latest how to use the workbench. Because they've made it so complex that you have to do this, and this, and find this, and this, and do it. And it strikes me as like overly complicated role-playing game style. This is how you build your skills level. So they have that ability to do that in video games. I think when video games, and like somebody used to say to me, is like, well, video game role playing is the same as regular tabletop role playing, and that's why I just wanted to call it all role playing. I'm like, no, it's not, in any way, shape, or form. To this day, it's still a more limiting system. It's got a lot more bells and whistles that can give you lots of great wow factor, and it's well thought out. but it's certainly, we haven't got to the point where an AI can pop in and throw you in an entirely different direction than you ever expected. In a storyline, you got open world stuff, but that's not the same as running a particular storyline. So, but it is fascinating that it can fall prey to the same traps of overly complicated systems.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I think one of the things where the difference happens is in like a video game or video role-playing game, a lot of the over complexity is in story.
Right.
Yeah. I would actually make an argument that that's not true.
Okay.
As someone who has played a few, and also at least on the Japanese side of role-playing games and some of the early American ones, there is so much stat and equipment min-maxing and everything that you have to do. And you have to find the right equipment to do the right job, and you have to deck your character out just right, following certain parameters and such, that I would argue that there's still a fairly heavy amount of engagement with the rules and metagame to being successful, even in a computer role-playing game. I mean, take a look at something like the Final Fantasy games, where you have like 50 different gems that you can match up to get different results with all these different weapons and gadgets and such. And you can store them in different ways. And some of these gems you can combine to produce different things. And it just goes on forever. Like, it was so intimidating. It's one of the reasons I never really got heavily into the games. It's just because there's so much crunchy metagaming going on that it's just insane.
There is, but it's not like a role-playing game, and this is the big diff, in that I have to learn the mechanics for calculating the formula for how much damage my sword does if it hits, based on this other formula that I have to memorize.
That is true.
You're right about the complexity, but the difference for like a tabletop game, and it's a big difference, it affects the experience, is that to make the world run, I have to learn the rules. I have to learn the formula. Whereas for any video game, the computer's doing it. And that's why I say you're right about all these different gadgets and combinations of equipment and items I find. But that's still an in-story thing. I can learn the stats and what works better than that, but I don't have to learn the fundamentals of how the computer is figuring out how much damage something does, or the resistance, or if I combine these things, why do I get this effect? Like, that formula is all done by the computer, whereas in a role-playing game, that's done by the participants.
It's almost like if you're doing a role-playing game, all the stuff you do before game to outfit your character and customize your character in a very specific way, they move in game in a video role playing game. Like Don says, the fact that you can put all these gems together doesn't stall the story in any way, shape, or form. It's just you trying to be able to facilitate something. Now, I don't think in Fallout 4 I have to make something specific to move that game forward, but it just allows me to create cooler weapons or something, for that reason. Yeah.
That's a valid point. It's not required, whereas in a game like what we're talking about, a hard role-playing game, it's definitely required. Now, I'm going to give two examples of how I see hard and soft, or rules heavy and rules light role-playing games. To me, in the softest or most rules light role-playing game I've ever encountered, and I actually still consider a role-playing game, although this is debatable, okay, and you may have other, would be the Baron Munchausen storytelling game.
Right.
I don't know if have either of you ever played it? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay.
But I'd love to.
Okay, Baron
really
Munchausen
cool.
is one of the coolest. It's, like I said, it's borderline whether it's a role-playing game or not. You guys can decide. But I still think it's one of the coolest things of its kind I've ever seen. The short version is that each person around the table takes on the role of a teller of tall tales, shall we say, okay? And each person has a certain amount of coins. And so what happens is that you randomly pick one person, and that person has to tell a tall tale. And as they're telling the tall tale, the other players around can actually make suggestions, all right, of about what happens in the game, what happens in the story. Like, for example, I could say, wasn't that your sister that you met? And I would push a coin at the person, okay? Then the person has to actually make a decision. If they accept it, they accept my coin. If they don't accept it, they have to double whatever I put down and push it back to me and say, no, it was my niece, or something like that. Okay? And you might wonder, why is that important? Well, the trick is, whoever has the most coins at the end of the night loses, and has to use that, in theory, to buy everyone around. It's supposed to be played in a bar or something like that. But they're the loser of the game. So the whole point of it is you're trying to actually lose all of your coins, because whoever loses all their coins first technically wins the game.
Up until that point of telling me about the coins, it
Yes.
was more of a theater game than it was an actual role-playing game. But
Right.
when you get to the point that you actually have to barter with each other for a winning or losing position,
Yes.
based upon that aspect, you're right. I think it actually enters at least a strategy game of some sort, or a tabletop game. It may not be effectively role-playing because you're not
Right.
necessarily taking up a role. But
But you are. You're not you. When you're telling that tall tale, this is the Baron Munchausen game. You're supposed to be an 18th century explorer type person sitting around an 18th century bar whenever Baron Munchausen was supposed to exist.
You didn't say that at the beginning.
Okay, I apologize.
No
I
worries.
apologize. So,
Okay.
so you are supposed to be telling a tale that's supposed to be taking place in, I don't think it's Elizabethan, but basically old Europe, basically. You know, in the age of sail and wonders and everything like that. And you're supposed to be telling about a true, quote unquote, true experience that happened to you. Okay. Also, the other neat thing is, you might wonder what happens if you run out of coins. And the answer is, it means that if someone gives you a coin, you have to do whatever they say. Whatever they say. So suddenly, the other participants in the game are basically running your story at that point, and you have no control over your own story. Although you may get a chance to get revenge later on, but that's why you have to be careful not to run out of coins. Otherwise, you'll never get a chance to get revenge on the other players. And so that, to me, I consider kind of a role-playing game, because you are taking on a role, and you are telling but instead of cooperatively going on an adventure, you're each telling about your own personal experiences and playing with the experiences that you have. Again, borderline between theater, story, role-playing. It's kind of like right on the edge of all of them. But to me, it's the most rules-light thing I could think of, short of people just sitting around and telling a story. Or cooperatively telling a story, I suppose. As far as rules...
When did that come out, anyway?
Came out in the 90s? It came out late 90s, I think. I can look it up. But give me a sec here.
So near the narrative...
Before it really took off on the internet, I'll check in a minute. I'll look it up for us. But on the other hand, the most rules crunchy thing I have ever seen in my entire life. Okay, you guys are about to laugh, but it's true. The most is Champions. Champions is the most rules crunchy thing I've ever seen in my entire life, and you'll laugh because it's one of my favorite role playing games of all time. But oh my God, does that game literally try to simulate everything under the sun? The only thing that might be as bad or equal to it, Champions, is Don's own role-playing game, the Akrima City role-playing game, which is also super rules-heavy.
Kinda, because that hits at a couple things.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing is the Baron Munchausen thing.
Yeah.
I would consider a role-playing game, but it's because, if you remember, I'm not big on, pinning down definitions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a simpler role-playing game, and that's one we've all played. Okay, I'm Darth Vader. No, I'm Luke Skywalker, and I stab you. You're dead. No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
No, but there needs to be... This is the thing why I said Baron Munchausen, though, is because it at least adds a rule set and engagement going on, whereas there are no rules to that kids playing imagination on the playground thing. That's just whatever they come up with at the moment. I still require it to be somewhat structured in some way to qualify as a role-playing game.
Now, see, I'm going to put forth the idea that you're not wrong. Exactly.
Thank you. You're right. I'm not wrong.
Yeah. But kids playing make-believe, there is a structure, and it goes back to what we were just saying about original D&D, that when the kid would take the role, they would have something in their mind. And like if like I'm Darth Vader, and all the participants have an idea of Darth Vader, and their concept of what Vader can do as a little kid is a combination of what you've seen and wish fulfillment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's that idea and it's that kind of activity that's the basis of the role-playing game, which is what happens when you get first D&D. It's very rules light because the assumption is that everybody participating is familiar with all of like the rules of the genre and the rules of whatever thing you're cribbing to throw into your game. And what ends up happening is as the game expands outward, you tend to get more rules because you're getting differing opinions. So if it's like me and my friends playing Star Wars as kids, we all have enough shared experience. Our perception is probably very similar. But if like my cousin from Toronto comes down and wants to play, his perception might be different because he would have had that slightly different experience. And it was the D&D thing that reading early issues of a lot of the fanzines and APAs, there would be debate that there was was it Boston? That the guys playing D&D in its earliest days in Boston were playing what they called Dungeons and Beavers. Beavers being the mascot of one of the local sports ball teams.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if it's Boston, but it was like another university. And there was this debate amongst people. Are they really playing D&D or are they doing their own thing? And it's because as it spreads out, you're bringing more people with more perspectives in.
True.
And that's the purpose of the rules. The rules are to make sure everybody's thinking along the same lines.
Right.
Okay. And that's why I say it comes from, I shot you. No, you didn't. Yeah, I did. You gotta die now. No, I didn't. You suck. You can't aim. And it comes out of that. It's that experience that gets formalized. And then the idea of rules heavy versus rules light gets down to the kind of experience that you're seeking and who you're participating in and kind of what your expectations are. Because you're right about something like Champions being one of the most rules heavy games ever, because they set a system up so you could simulate anything you wanted.
Yep. Yes, they did.
But they do it weird because I'm going to say that another game that's kind of on that level would be GURPS.
Yes.
But the big difference is that Champions is more... It's more complex because the way the formulas work, there's a lot more to calculating things and how you succeed or how you don't. And there's a lot of stuff that conceptually exists only as a game function. That when you do like combat, it's like your defensive rating versus your offensive rating, and I'm rolling, my target is 11 modified by like R2 ratings, and there's different ways of calculating it. Those aren't things that relate to anything kind of real world or story directly.
Right. Yeah.
They're abstracts on ability, whereas GURPS has the same kind of complexity and the same huge lists of modifiers and equipment and stuff, but the underlying mechanics are different because I have to roll under my target number, which is based on my skill. The higher the number, the better. And you can relate things conceptually to story or reality. So if I have pistol at 15, 15's really good, so I'm a good shot. If I've got 20, 20 is like super good. I'm like one of them Old West trick shooter kind of guys. And it's a more direct relation between story concept and mechanic.
Yes, that's true. I will say GURPS is better than that. Side note, GURPS, of course, is actually based loosely on Champions. That was their inspiration for the rule set they used for GURPS, was the original Champions game.
Steve Jackson game too?
No. GURPS is Steve Jackson, but Champions was originally made by... Oh, they weren't originally called Hero Games. They were called something else back in the day. I'd have to look it up. But they were... They published under Iron Crown, I think, originally was under. I'd have to look it up, but anyway.
Yeah, I think everybody did Champions at some point.
Yeah, Champions moved around a little bit, but no, Champions is really old. It's not the first superhero role playing game, but you could argue it might be the first complete one. I think I remember we did our episode, and I think it slightly even predates Villains and Vigilantes. They're basically contemporaries with each other, but it was Champions was definitely one of the very first point-based role-playing games where the characters were built using like a point system instead of just rolling stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, and it set the standard, which is why GURPS basically followed that standard. They said, yeah, there's too many stats here, and it's a little too complex, but yeah, let's make it a little more realistic, and anyway, simplify it down. And so that's what became GURPS, even though they're completely different companies, completely different sets of people producing it, etc. By the way, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen was published in 1998 by Hogshead Publishing.
Oh, okay.
It's had several different editions since then, including one by Steve Jackson Games. The most recent one being a 2016 edition of the game by Fantasy Flight Games, which was the third edition with I highly, highly recommend it if you get the chance. Although inherently the game is so damn simple that it's like I don't know where they get enough content really to have that book out, or maybe that's just the way we played it. I don't know, because at heart it's not much more than I described to you. You can literally teach someone how to play it in 5 minutes. Yet the book itself is actually like a thick, hardbound monster.
Wow.
So I don't know where I think the rest of it's supposed to be setting up the setting and inform you about what the setting is like and such that the characters are supposed to be living in, where they tell their tall tales or something to that effect. But I highly recommend it anyway. It's a lot of fun. It's probably the best party role playing type game thing I've ever played. But on the other hand, Champions is also a hell of a lot of fun too. You just have to be willing to work with the numbers. I mean, it's a kind of simulationist, I think would be the term. Maybe I'm wrong. Game where they are trying to simulate reality. So they're trying to, like, here's a set of rules you can use to simulate almost anything. Have fun. You just have to kind of work around things a little bit.
Yeah.
And that was the goal. So that's why you buy Energy Blast, but that Energy Blast can literally represent everything from rocks to wind or whatever you. The actual way it looks and affects the world is completely separate, as Don was saying, from the actual numbers and stats.
Cool.
Yeah.
To a point. I mean, if it can only still do so much damage. So yeah, that in that sense, it is still tied into the stat stuff. But anyway, so those are probably the most rules heavy and rules light games I can come up with anyway, short of kids playing on the playground, as Don pointed out. And there's many things in between, such as Dungeons and Dragons when it first started was more rules light, as we talked about, but then AD&D came out and fixed that problem.
Right.
Fixed it good.
Exactly. It's like, how many rules can we cram in here for everything under the sun? Let's try.
Jeez.
And that was AD&D. But in fairness, I mean, that's what some people enjoyed back in those days, so that's what they did.
I mean, we can laugh about it, and I know you don't really enjoy playing AD&D, but there's a reason why it was the number one role playing game by far for many years, and it really did sort of set the standard for so many like games to come. Things like hit points, whatever you wanted to call them. And even into the video games that you can see video games being built upon the styles and the systems designed in Dungeons and Dragons initially,
Oh, definitely.
Reasons. I know that, like, I just remembered this when you guys were talking, like, when I was a kid, my parents, in their attempt to try to make me do better math, got me this book on, like, math games. And and most of them I completely ignored because they were stupid. But one of them I really, really liked was this game where you kind of, like, figured out, it's extremely simple, but you were a tank, and you basically figured out, you tried to shoot another tank by coming up with a particular number. I always hated playing my cousin because he was amazing in math and he could figure out how to hit me every single time, because it wasn't obviously a very and he was like a year or two older than me, so his math skills were a little further ahead. I guess it was definitively there was very little role playing. I mean, very little chance involved. It was very much specifically, you know, if you do this, you will hit the guy, kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
And so once I started realizing he was hitting me every time, I suddenly didn't want to play the game anymore because it was no fun. So that was like the most light thing that I remembered ever playing that was close to that kind of thing. And then I guess the most difficult thing that I played, which was just frustrating beyond end, was Starship Battles or Starfleet Battles.
Oh yeah, another game I enjoyed.
Yeah, it's just there's like so many rules. I mean, spaceship combat in Traveler was a nightmare too. I actually created little basic programs using my VIC-20 to try to simplify the combat system in Traveler. I really love Traveler as a role-playing game, but it was just it was extremely complex about certain things. So
that's the one spaceship combat game of its era I never actually played. I never actually experienced Traveler's spaceship combat. Maybe that's a good thing.
Oh yeah, it really was. I'm glad that GURPS kind of grabbed it, because their combat was so much easier to play Traveler 2 than the original one they had. But I mean, Traveler was like, it came out in what, 78, 79? So it is one of the first role-playing games, probably. Well, I think Space Opera was the first science fiction role-playing game, but I think Traveler was certainly the most popular of them all. So
let me double check that, because I think Traveler predates Space Opera, but we'll double check on that. Space Opera was 1980, so I'm pretty sure that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Traveler, and we can double check. Okay, Traveler game
is like 78 or 79.
Traveler game, there we go. Traveler game is 77.
77. Wow. I was going to say 77.
So yeah,
I still have the book. Yeah.
Yeah. So
somebody lied to me. Somebody told me that Space Opera was longer, and I believed them all these years. Thank you, DNA, for clarifying.
That's what we're here for, man. That's what we're here for. We're here to do it right. And
I think they're thinking of a different one.
There might have been another one.
I think there's one. I think Traveler's still older, but I think again it was late 70s, because Space Opera was the the FGU one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was.
Fantasy Games Unlimited. But there was, because I think there was another.
Are you thinking about Star Frontiers?
That came later. That came after. Yeah.
That was like 81 or 82, I think. No, there was one older. It's one of those games that you've never heard of, you've never seen, by a company that was around for a week and disappeared.
Right.
Like Star Frontiers was 1982. I apologize. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can't. But I do think there was one.
Star Frontiers came from TSR, like it came from the D&D folk.
Yeah. Yeah, because Star Frontiers is one that we played the hell out of around here.
Did you? Did you like it?
It's pretty good. It kind of it skirts the line between like 80s heroic Saturday morning sci-fi and pulp sci-fi.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Sure.
But the Starship combat rules they did are one of the best that I've ever seen.
Cool.
Okay, I could totally see that. Yeah, you mean the Nighthawk rules? I think they're called Nighthawk. Yeah, I loved those. Those were awesome. That actually did also turn into one of my favorite spaceship combat things. Although I still only got to play it once or twice. I've still mostly played Starfleet Battles.
So you really like the rules heavy games?
I do, actually, or at least I did. It's one of those things. When I was young, I loved them. That's true. And then as I've gotten older, the older I've gotten, the less I like them. It's an odd thing where now, if you would ask me to choose a role-playing game, I would probably choose one that was medium light. Right. Like, I would probably choose the hardest game. I'm not even sure I'd even play Champions. I still have a copy of the last couple editions, but I'm not sure I'd actively want to play Champions anymore, just because to me, it's really just about getting into the story and having fun. So I'd probably prefer to play something more rules light. with GURPS being about as hard as I'd go at this point.
Cool.
But yeah, that's why. I like games that encourage creativity and that are more about storytelling and having fun than trying to simulate reality, because I think that's a pointless exercise. But back in the day when I was young, absolutely, if there was I never met a rules heavy role playing game I didn't like, except for oh my god, there was one. What was it called? There was actually a game. And it literally looked like a phone book. Like, we make jokes about champions being able to stop a bullet, but this thing literally could. And it looked like a bullet, and it was kind of someone's version of Rifts, but it was more fantasy, and it was just huge. And I'm trying to remember what it was called. I'll look it up while we're talking, but it's. And they had a copy at my local sci-fi bookstore, and it sat there forever because everyone would kind of pick it up, flip through it, and go, "Whoa!" And then they just put it down, and then that was no one. So
back
no one
away
actually,
slowly.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what they do. And I'm trying to remember what it was called. I know the audience is curious, so I will do my best to figure out what it was called. But fantasy RPG. Okay, RPG. Anyway, so you don't. I'll look it up in a moment. But so Jack, you don't really like rules heavy games?
No, I really don't. I think I've always. What I've done is even for the rules heavy games of like D&D and stuff like that, because I got into AD&D because of the complexity and stuff like that. But I often like shucked away much of the stuff that would slow down the gameplay, or I would modify it based upon my story. I found myself as I got even into later high school and university that the monster manuals, for example, were kind of like guides for me to jump off of, because I like the idea of creating a goblin by name, but and by by feel, whatever, but entirely different, so that when somebody's like, "Oh, we have to fight a goblin," I've got this. And then it would be 20 hit dice. You know what I mean? Because it was the monster goblin that lived at the back of the lot, right? A swamp goblin or something like that. Because I like the idea of being able to put the fear back into people by doing enough modification. Because we all played those games where somebody would just take the rule book, memorize it, and then stop the gameplay halfway through going, "No, you can't do that." You know what I mean? And sometimes it made sense, and sometimes it really went against the story. Right. And so, and that's what it all came down for me. It all came down to story. I had no problem modifying things as long as by the end of the day people felt they had a good story that was told. So,
right.
But you didn't want to make it so obvious. That's the thing. That's why it's so important as a DM or a GM or whoever is like to roll your dice behind your screen. Because sometimes the dice don't matter, and you're like, I've got to just pretend that they made this because they're all going to die if I don't. And this is a terrible place for them to die. I was not one of those people who was really anxious to kill off the entire party. Because, nobody comes back to your house then.
That's exactly right. And the story you've planned out ends up being, like, thrown completely off. So, no, I totally get that.
Now today with Brian Welcher, who you've already had and I played with before, I think I've mentioned to you in the past. He has like the most amazing role playing like cave where he has ridiculous amounts of miniatures and games and the whole bit, and he has so many Pathfinder modules that they'll never get to play them all. So he'll pull something off the shelf. And if they honestly all die off, they'll never play that game again. They won't make new characters. So it goes to the dustbin of history, which really puts a desire in people who have just spent 16 hours or whatever it is trying to finish off that campaign to not lose their characters. There is that tension, right? And that's what people are always looking for, is that tension of real stakes going on in a good game.
So that's kind of their... Oh, so that's why he does that, to just create that tension. So it's like, if you fail this, you will never get another chance. That's right. It.
None of us will. It will sit there and haunt us because I will face it outwards so we can see from the bookshelf what we have failed to do.
Yep, that's the game
saying
we
that.
all failed.
I don't think he said. I'm sure he would agree with me on that, but I don't think he's done that. And there are times that they sit there and they'll mention a campaign and you'll see the entire table just shudder like, oh God, that was awful. That just killed us all, and I really want to go back and see what happened in the end, but we never will. So, and they're not allowed to read it or anything. It's great. It's really quite cool. So,
well, of course they do when Brian leaves the room. They just grab it and it's like, okay, what happened? What was supposed to happen?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, no, I can see that. But you are also a huge fan of second edition D&D, aren't you? And isn't that relatively rules heavy?
Well, again, yes and no. I mean, second edition was certainly, I think it was actually more role-playing oriented than first edition advanced D&D, which was much more stats oriented. And I also love, like, I bought everything a second edition because I really love the kits that they had, which a lot of that stuff sort of got incorporated in later on elements of D&D. But, you could have, like, the Magician's Kit, or the Magic User's Kit, I should say, and there'd be, 15 different kinds of Magic Users. But for me, it wasn't... you do that way before the game starts, and that's creating really unique kind of characters that you can utilize to roleplay with. Instead of just being stuck with Magic User, Cleric, or Priest, Fighter, Ranger, Paladin, Thief, Assassin, Monk, you had... a pile of different options to be able to do for variety. But those are story challenges, right? Those are story variety things more than anything else. They're not like, well, I hit his elbow, but it glanced off his armor. Like, I didn't care about encumbrance.
Right.
I really didn't. It didn't make any difference to me for encumbrance because Brian's, they really worry about encumbrance, but to me, figuring out encumbrance every single time would slow me down. And in a movie, they don't care about encumbrance in a movie when you're watching a fantasy movie. Really? Have you ever seen, like, do they sit there with Lord of the Rings going, well, how are we going to carry this box? They don't think about that. They just give it to somebody and they move on. Because spending that time figuring it out, right? Just like, diseases and magical diseases tend to have more element in a story than just, I've got, athlete's foot. My character has athlete's foot. How's that going to change the story, right? But I rolled it, and now I have athlete's foot. So nowadays, it's interesting about the Pathfinder. He has, like, critical cards, right? Which are kind of interesting because if you do get a critical, then you just pull a critical card and it tells you what it is. Now, those effects... suddenly those can affect the gaming of the story, and if your character suddenly goes blind for the next 3 days, that can really make a big difference in your storyline. So those things I kind of find fun. So again, it all comes down to how is this going to advance the story in a meaningful way? If it's going to slow down and we're going to spend all of our time looking up stats rather than moving through scenes, I got it down to a point that I could get through, like, if I was with a bunch of people, it would be like 3 different scenes or encounters or whatever. But if I was doing a really good campaign, we could get up to 7, right? But if I'm going to spend all that time doing stuff on stats, we may not get out of the tavern for enough, and that would be no fun.
Definitely.
For me.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Yeah. That makes sense. And yeah, the more I hear about Brian's games and that, the more I wish I lived next door, and so I had an excuse to go over and play. Because oh my god, I imagine, even though I'm not a huge AD&D fan or whatever, I think we're D&D fan in general. I think it would be awesome to play in his games, Pathfinder. Yeah.
I think it'd be really cool if you guys could send him an email and convince him to do a live, like, videotaping of it and put like the video on the DNA thing, just so you can see, go through the process of what one of his games is like, kind of thing, and see his place and have that all videotaped. That would be very cool. Of course, in 2020 when we have MadCon, I'm hoping both of you guys will be down here and I can take you personally. But
yeah. Well, I hope to see his cave maybe in 2020. We'll see what happens. We'll talk about that later. Anyway,
Sure.
So by the way, the game that I was referencing earlier, I found it.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
The game that no one wanted to buy, but oh my god, is that thing huge? It was a game called The World of Cinnabar.
Oh, yeah.
Which is noted for, some people call it one of the worst role-playing games of all time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not, those aren't my words. Those actually come from Mind Hackers. Anyway, it's referenced on the Wikipedia page. The World of Cinnabar. It's a story about, I'll read you the setting. Cinnabar is actually Mars, 50,000 years in the future, hollowed out and turned into a spaceship to take humanity to a safe place after Earth had been destroyed. Civilization is beginning to rebuild after a series of disasters, and technology is practiced as a religion. Cinnabar is also known for bizarre monsters, including the giant mutant fire clam and the flying grizzly, capable of shooting laser beams from its eyes. Guilds and organizations play a major role in the Cinnabar. Guilds and organizations play a major role in the Cinnabar world ship. Mortals are often able to interact with immortals, demigods, and even the gods themselves. So it's kind of like Rifts, it's that super techno fantasy thing. It came out in like 1991 for first edition, 93 for second edition. And yeah, it's meant to be, and everything in the kitchen sink setting and game and everything. But that's why the book is monstrously thick. And it's just, and the rule system itself is just monstrously detailed, but not very well explained. So that's why it's considered to be, to have a very poor design by some reviewers. RPGNet review of The World of Cinnabar. Yeah, people, I'll link to the information about it in the show notes if people are that curious.
Cool.
Yeah. But yeah, it comes from that kind of Rifts era where people were just throwing everything together.
Yeah, you guys are kind of bumping up against one of the tricks that I think causes problems for like tabletop gaming, is that a rules heavy and a rules light game are different experiences. Because you guys are talking about how now you don't care for the rules heavy ones, but I enjoy both. And I can remember too, playing like a lot of super rules heavy games. There was always a certain joy in learning the rules. It was like a rite of passage kind of thing.
Right.
And a lot of times the more complicated rules will facilitate different kinds of action. It's like you guys were talking about encumbrance. Encumbrance is one of those things that it comes up because when you got people coming into gaming as games, as opposed to kind of a continuation of fandom, you had people who would like to kind of, well, cheating isn't the right word, but in the spirit of cheating, would do things like, okay, so I'm wearing like my plate mail armor, and I got 15 magic swords, and I'm carrying 3 shields, and like I'm carrying like 500,000 gold pieces that we found at the dragon, and it would get ridiculous. You wanted some kind of mechanic for what physically can my character, handle, and that's why you got things like AD&D. AD&D was famous for obsessively keeping track of certain things and letting others go. So encumbrance was basically just for weapons, armor, and treasure. But an encumbrance of 80 was your backpack and all of your tools, whether you were carrying 15 lanterns and a pickaxe or just a pocket set of lockpick tools. Because you're always kind of fighting that idea of simulating the reality for the characters of what's happening versus the feel, versus the quickness of the play. And I think what ends up happening is you go through different trends where the state of the art for gaming is one or the other. And then that becomes the big thing that the standard that every game is fairly or unfairly held to.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, because that was, again, going to the the mid-90s, early mid-90s, where the more narrativist games were getting popular, and they tended to be stripped down mechanically, because the idea was that you're playing the story just as much as the character, so you're not obsessively keeping track of the character's reality. You're kind of keeping more track of the character's dramatic circumstances, and games were getting simpler. The rules were getting simpler. I remember there was a big debate. There were people who were saying, and that's the future of gaming. It's strictly going to be these very drama-based rules, light, blah, blah, blah. Then the D20 system happens, which harkens back to the good old days of D&D.
Right.
Which is a giant, massive, super rules-heavy kind of thing. And it becomes the most popular thing ever, and then you see everything go that way. Because I remember once the third edition, the D20 system took off, there were fantasy games, I can't remember the game, that if I stabbed you, there were rules for based on what weapon I was using and my strength, how big and deep the stab wound was, and then how much you'd bleed out based on the size of the stab wound. And I'm like, this is maybe a little obsessive, but again, it's that idea, every time the pendulum swings one way or the other, it goes a little further, because people don't realize that tabletop gaming has a state of the art. That somebody will do something and it adds something to the experience. It gives you a new element that you can play with, and then everybody goes nuts with that, and that's why you tend to see these big phases of rules heavy, rules light kind of thing.
Right.
And there's no ultimate experience. There's no perfect role-playing game, simply because they're all different. You're getting something different out of each and every one, and that's why it moves back and forth, and that's why that's a great thing.
Right.
Sometimes you want to role-play a Tom Clancy novel, so you need something like GURPS that details all of the little fiddly bits that make the event and the situation real. And sometimes you want an Arnie film where, you just come in and go, and then throw a helicopter at the bad guys, even though you're supposed to be a normal human. And then that goes more like rules light and stuff. And that's why it's always that back and forth, because there's always going to be, a different experience. People will get comfortable and jaded with one, and then the other one kicks off.
Let me go back to the original title of this episode, between the hard and the soft, and reflecting back to, like you were mentioning, the hard and soft science fiction, right? So, because hard science fiction requires you to be really detailed about, one of my favorite radio dramas was Cold Equation. And it was an X-1 episode, and basically it's a guy who's flying, I think he's going to Mars, and there's a woman who has come aboard, and the cold equation is she's got to die, because if she doesn't, we don't have enough air, food, or oxygen for anybody to make it there. So she's got to walk out that airlock. And effectively, that's what ends up happening, because there's nothing you can do about that. That's about as hard sci-fi as you can get, right? If this were Buck Rogers, he would, jimmy up something that made absolutely no sense, and because it was high-level adventure. So in the same way, you've got the hard science fiction aficionados and the crunchy, hard role-playing guys who want the level of realism. It could be based very definitively upon those kinds of genres. It doesn't make sense to have a Chinese action movie as a hard, crunchy role-playing game, because it's designed to be adventurous and fun and loose.
I've done it.
Yeah.
I of course I've done it. But, and oddly enough, the best system I found for doing that kind of thing before, this is in the past, was, I tried all the different systems. I made my players play, Chinese kung fu action stuff using several different systems like GURPS and all kinds of systems. But the best one was actually the hero system, Champions. It actually...
Did you play Feng Shui?
Yes, I did.
I really like that. I've never played Champions, to be honest, so I don't know. But I really like Feng
Shui. Was okay. It's a little bit loose for my taste. It works hard to simulate the genre, but at the time, you see, again, this is the difference between me back then. I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago.
I wonder if you'd feel the same way now.
Probably not. Like I said, actually, to be honest, my favorite martial arts role-playing game that I came across was mentioned in a recent episode, which is actually, at least they called it Ninja Crusade or something to that effect, that I played at a role-playing game testing a year or two back, where everything was tied into how creative you were with your martial arts move descriptions, determined pretty much your chance of success. And so I thought that was neat. Weapons of the Gods also does that, and so that's really cool. And maybe if I went back and tried Feng Shui again, that would probably be okay. But back at the time, remember, Champions was made for superhero comics, specifically Silver Age superhero comics. And so as an end result, it has that, bashing guys knocking each other around kind of feel to it down. That's kind of what it's made for. And so that interfaced pretty well with the whole martial arts thing. Like, I found that worked pretty well. And even once we added martial arts superpowers and things like that, also worked pretty well. That's why there was an actual supplement for the hero system called Ninja Hero that was literally meant to be used to use champions to play, martial arts movie style games and old Chinese movie stuff. But again, if you want to go hard rules with it, that would probably be the best choice. But modern stuff, Weapons of the Gods, if it was still in print, or Ninja Crusade would be where I'd probably go. But again, so again, your tastes just change with time, right? That's just kind of the way it is. And it also depends on, I'm old now, so I just don't want to spend a lot of time playing with the rules anymore. But on the other hand, I do actually still appreciate the feel that a hard role-playing game can actually give you. Like, there's a certain amount of, because it does enforce a certain play style and a way of thinking on you. Yeah. And sometimes that can actually be a good thing. Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have thought that it was just that you're old and you don't want to learn new stuff. I would have thought that it's more like you are like me, effectively all about story now. Like, you write.
That's pretty much it. Yeah, you're right.
So if that's where your head is at, then you're going to be focusing most of your role playing experience on how to develop the best story possible.
I think so, and that's probably mostly it. That's also one of the reasons probably why I mostly stopped playing role-playing games, is because in the end I was just telling stories with a group of people, and to be blunt, it was mostly me leading them through my story in the end. I wasn't getting a lot from a lot of my players, so that's why I quit.
Yeah. I'm the same way. Like, I feel like I'm cheating my actual writing when I go and roleplay. Even though I get all the aspect of the social aspect and the whole bit, in the end I feel really like it's time lost more than time gained, because that it's really a moment in time. It's not like somebody can go and pick up that book again or watch that movie again and go and relive that. It's I can't explain those moments to the same degree to somebody who wasn't there, and so it really is. It's lost with the people who have experienced when they're gone. So part of one of the reasons why I like writing and stuff like that is creating something that potentially other generations could enjoy somewhere down the line.
Right.
Huh.
I can see that, yeah.
I think you guys are kind of missing out on the advantage of a role-playing game.
Okay.
Because I can definitely see your point that what's happened with you guys, because you are writers, is you come into a story as a writer, and a role-playing game is an event. Yep. And this is where I find for writing, if you've got a good group, and this is going to go to what I think is one of the biggest differences between heavy and light rules-based games. When you set up a story, you're in control of all of the elements.
Right.
Certain things might have to play out a certain way in a story, but if you really wanted to, you can find a way to fudge it. You can go back, you can re-edit. A role-playing game is the exact opposite, that you're setting something up and then you're seeing where it goes.
Right.
And I think this is one of the reasons why a rules-heavy game, like you guys were saying, it leads you down a certain path. It sets up a very specific way that things happen, to the point that, as we had talked about an episode or two back, a lot of things that happen in role-playing games become their own thing. And now we're starting to see that spill off into other forms of entertainment. It's again that idea of like how hit points work. We talked about that in another show, that you're kind of starting to see shows that work like that, or some of the old tropes that like we meet at the inn, or this guy goes up a level, or that you're seeing very similar, not just in the lit RPG stuff, but in like regular shows. But what? Oh, go ahead.
I would say that, but I think we talked about that too, that I think a big part of that actually though is because we're getting whole generations of writers and everything that grew up on those games. Many of them were even GMs in those games.
I was going to ask you about that specifically because Japan really took off with D&D, didn't they?
Oh yeah, they were
crazy
went,
like,
for D&D.
Crazy for D&D. So is that the original or the original or the origin of the whole video games and manga and all that other stuff of leveling up and stuff like that? Do you think that those writers were people who were playing D&D back in the 80s and wanted to be able to translate that in animation and all that other form?
Well, there's a catch with the Japanese, as there always is. Yes and no. D&D was popular in Japan, but it was nowhere near as popular as the early computer role-playing games that everyone played that were based on D&D.
Yeah.
Like the very first Final Fantasy games, for example.
Oh, I thought you were talking about like the text-based ones.
Well, there's those too. Those weren't that popular. But the ones that came out like for the early consoles and for the early computers and such, like the PC-98 and everything back in Japan, those really were huge. I can't overstate how huge those things were back in the day. And so this is why most Japanese, their concept of role-playing, like levels and hit points and all that all comes from computer role-playing games. That doesn't come from actual D&D directly.
Okay.
D&D was a game that was played by nerds for the most part in Japan. It wasn't played by the general public.
Okay. Yeah, but that's that idea of idea creep that it does come from, because those games did borrow the mechanics of D&D.
Mm-hmm.
Not to mention it's nerds that are the writers too, right? So if we're talking about the writers that are coming in through that, even now in Hollywood, how many of the people who are writing action, adventure, fantasy, stuff like that started off playing D&D or some kind of role-playing game?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
So that's why I was wondering about that. That you're right. It maybe didn't hit main culture, but it didn't have to.
Right.
The world turns on the nerd.
Exactly. We are the center of everything. Thus, the Department of Nerdly Affairs is necessary to protect the general public from nerddom.
That's right.
Dun 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 dun. Containment is a big part of the mission.
Exactly. But yes, that's basically what happened, and I think that's true for a lot of places. That it wasn't the actual pen and paper role playing game that introduced them to these ideas. It was mostly imported Japanese video games, and it's this chain reaction thing. The Japanese took it, they made video games, and then when Nintendo and everything went all around the world, they took their video games with them. They took the early Phantasy Star and Final Fantasy. And there's another one that I know I'm missing that's actually super important. And this is why you can tell if you're looking at something that was inspired by Japanese games rather than D&D if there's a slime in it. Because the Japanese, being the lovers of cute things, fell in love with the idea of slimes. Like they thought they were the greatest thing ever.
Okay.
So all early role-playing games, all the early Japanese stuff has slimes in it.
And game shows, apparently.
Well, yeah, there's
slime falls off of buckets and stuff like that.
Well, there's that too.
Yeah.
But that's why slimes are just an integral part, because they're usually like the low-level monster your character first meets in a Japanese game, and usually has to kill to gain the experience points to go do other stuff. It's interesting in the early Japanese stuff. Usually, you weren't facing off against orcs or goblins. Like goblins would be the popular one in a North American D&D campaign. Your players would meet goblins. It's like, okay. But in Japanese stuff, usually you'd start with animals or monsters like slimes and kind of work your way up. Yeah, I think Dragon Quest was probably the first, or if not the first game of that kind. So, and Dragon Quest was also Square Enix, and it started in 1986. It actually for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And it predates Final Fantasy by a year.
Yeah.
So there you go. It's probably Dragon Quest I'm thinking of. Yeah, as the other one. It also had the advantage, at least some of the later ones, maybe the early ones, Akira Toriyama did the designs for them. And he's the creator of Dragon Ball. And his designs became iconic. Also, it's Dragon Quest where the slime... Yes, that's it, because it's Dragon Quest where the slimes are an iconic part of the game. Later versions, the characters even have like pet slimes that sit on their shoulders and stuff, because everyone loved the slimes.
Ew.
And they were merchandisable as hell, which is the main point. Because they're basically like... You can make little toys of them that are basically just colored bean bags, right? And everyone thinks that they're the cutest thing ever, especially with a little face on them.
Because they look like the poo emoji.
Yeah, they do.
Oh my god.
Yep, exactly. And Dragon Quest was originally called Dragon Warrior. I believe in Japan, something like that. Yeah, Dragon Warrior in North America, Dragon Quest in Japan. There we go. Oh, that's how it worked. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, that became kind of the standard. It was the game that everyone played, and so that's the game that everyone remembers and knows the monsters from. Yeah. And it looks like the poop emoji, except it's like blue. Imagine a blue poop emoji, and that's the slime.
See your doctor.
Yes, see doctor if continues.
It's the designed by Toriyama himself, Akira Toriyama. It's the official mascot of the Dragon Quest series. Wow. And so there we go. It's this little blue blob shaped like a water droplet with a face.
Yeah.
There they are. So if you see that, or the Final Fantasy monster that you can spot everywhere in the Japanese-inspired stuff is the Chocobo, which is like they're the horse birds.
Yeah.
Horse birds.
Yeah.
Don't we call those Pegasus?
Or that's a horse. That's not what they are at all. They're like an oversized ostrich that basically you can ride. They're like riding ostrich.
Oh.
They're diatremas.
You got me there. I don't know what that is. Is that the animals from Joust?
Nah, those are like ostriches. No, the old prehistoric terror birds.
Oh, okay.
The Forahecos, the diatrema, those ones, like the big 6-foot axe beak thingies. That's basically what they are. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
It's basically the super nasty killer shark versions of ostriches, with giant claws. Except the ones in Final Fantasy are very nice and generally
chicken-like.
Yeah, more chicken-like. Yeah, yeah. Think of them as giant riding chickens. I guess that might actually be a better way to describe them. Anyway, so the Japanese, just finish.
Everything is weirder in Japan.
Yes, it is. They have their own take on things. They have their own take on things.
For sure.
Well, I think Jack was right.
But interestingly enough, the Japanese seem to prefer overall. I've seen some Japanese actual role-playing games and such, and they're actually relatively rules light. They seem to actually prefer the slightly more rules light stuff. Like they don't get they don't get much crunchier than like maybe about 2nd edition D&D level, but even then, not usually.
Well, they do it weird. Japanese role-playing games tend to be rules light, but they do odd things because they were ahead of the curve. And this kind of ties back around to the point that I think I was starting about 20 minutes ago.
Sure, might as well. Go ahead.
That what ends up happening, and I'll bring this back forward here. I think I'm going to do some mental gymnastics, but the advantage, if you're looking at it in terms of developing writing, of a rules-heavy game is that games that have more detailed, more complex rules tend to lock you into certain methodologies and certain courses of action. Mm-hmm. So like AD&D obsessively keeping track of encumbrance means there were a lot of things I couldn't do. Like I couldn't carry an infinite number of arrows, and I couldn't carry like my +2 axe and my +5 broadsword because it would just weigh me down too much. I couldn't carry enough loot. And what it does is it makes the events of the game, it kind of takes them in a way out of the hands of the game master and the players. Mm-hmm. That the game world exists more of its own volition. Mm-hmm. And this is where there's a value to that, because even as game master, it forces you along certain ways of thinking. And you can always change the rules. I found for myself at a certain point, I stopped doing that. I started playing every game I ran right out of the box, as they say, because it was always a different experience. That it wasn't, when I would tinker with them, I found I was bringing them towards kind of my own personal concept of how the universe should work, and I decided to stop because that cheated me out of part of the fun of the game. Like, the goofy, obsessive rules in that add to the experience. Like D&D, obsessively keeping track of how much pocket change you have, because it's gonna weigh you down, literally, if you've played. It's weird, it's goofy, it's clunky, but it's part of AD&D. It kind of makes the experience.
In a strange way, I not that I see your point in a strange way, but in a strange way, you could almost make the argument that if you're not a very good role player, in the respect that you've never played role-playing games before, and you and your friends are sitting down trying to do this, you're almost better off with a more complex, crunchy game, because it keeps you boxed in within the system and in the world that way, so that it won't go off the rails to the same degree. And also, if you have a game master who really isn't that creative as a story person, you could be doing better work for your whole team to run with something really crunchy that way as well. And I'm not trying to, I'm sure you can do both. I'm not saying it can't. I'm just saying it can really help for those people who find themselves as neophytes in that direction.
Yeah, definitely, because there's a whole school of role-playing games that I love, and I don't know what you'd call them, but it requires a certain kind of player. And this is games like we've mentioned on the show before. A few of my favorites would be like Cosmic Patrol, or
which I really
edition.
Want to get a copy of, by the way. I really love whenever you talk about it, because I think you sent me like an online version or something, but I sort of just glanced through it and I've lost it. I've got to buy myself an actual hard copy somewhere, so because I think it'd be fun.
Yeah, and it is. It's because now you like the pulp sci-fi adventure.
Big time, yeah.
And that's what the game is based on, and it's a super mechanics light game, because it harkens back to white box D&D, that it's assumed that everybody who plays it is up on the genre,
right?
And that they're just going to completely ham it up.
Yeah.
Like, the game is designed for that. If my heroic hero comes in and gives the, we have to save the galaxy from these evil aliens, and I will lead the charge, and you're doing dramatic speeches and all that, you get bonuses in the game.
Yeah, in the same way that it came from the late show, you have to really have an understanding of the genre. When I played it with my sons, we watched Amazon Women on the Moon first, so they could get a feel for it, right? So, so it worked, so.
You actually you came from the late show?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't know you'd actually run it.
After your wonderful episode, hyperlink here, for the horror things, I went and bought Chill, and I bought it came from the Great Late Show online, because I thought they both sounded like a really interesting. Now, I honestly haven't gotten into Chill yet at all. I haven't even cracked it open, but we had so much fun with it. Came from the Late Show. It was great, and so I went out and found Amazon Women on the Moon, the movie, and then did my own personal edits to remove certain scenes that were extremely funny from an adult point of view, but not something you want to show your teens and preteens. And so I just gave them the feel for it, and then we ran a little campaign, which was, I think, the main campaign that came in the actual box. And it was fun. And we didn't finish it, of course, but it was... The boys really started to get into it, and it was quite cool. So,
oh, that's good. That's really good. Okay. Whereas Chill would give them a very different experience.
For sure.
The only thing is, the only problem I have with what you said, Don, is that I could see Rule Lite being a much easier sell for non-gamers to get them into role-playing games.
Yeah, it kind of depends what you're doing and what you're getting and who your person is.
Yes.
Because I've met people who are, I guess you say, more like scientifically inclined, and they totally dig a more complicated game because, again, part of the satisfaction is seeing how the events play out, and a more detailed system where you're actively participating in the formula that's translating the events happening to the characters into data, which translates into results. There's an appeal to that. What you're getting at, what you're specifically getting at, and this takes us back to how the Japanese write games, is the idea, like we said at the beginning, role-playing games proper are to get everybody on the same page, get them thinking in the same direction.
Right, yeah.
A lot of rules light ones kind of start with the position that you're already kind of headed that way. And that's why, it came from the Late Show. If you've got a bunch of people who are fans of old schlock theater stuff, they already have an idea. They know what the missing reel shtick is. They know the idea of calling in a stunt double. They know the idea of your character getting pissy, and you can call for a rewrite to change how the scene played out. Blah blah blah. They understand that. They understand all of the weird effects in that, and they'll play along. If you've got somebody who isn't aware of that, they're at a disadvantage in the game because the game is written around that understanding. It's harder to get them up to speed. Japanese games tend to kind of split the difference where they'll have mechanics for things, but the mechanics are designed to get you up to speed of the genre more than they are to simulate the events happening in the story.
Right.
Okay. I guess I think I can kind of see your point. So the Japanese games are still meant for people that maybe don't know the genre or are not don't really know quite what to do yet.
Kind of. I guess the easiest way to look at it would be the 90s Gundam role-playing game from Japan.
Okay.
The one that when you were in Japan you sent me a copy of.
Yes.
Despite Gundam essentially being Japan's Star Trek and the technology being so analyzed and thought out and paced and such a part of the story, the game doesn't get into the fussy bits of the stats for all of the mechs. Like you said, they're very like light on actual mechanics and formula, but they get way into how things play out.
Right.
So, for instance, when you do combat, the two things about the game that I thought were weird is combat movement is relative. So you've got, say, the player in their mech, and the D20, the first edition D20 Star Wars role-playing game does this kind of thing too. That you're charting movement based on the character's mech, their ship and that. So the way you plot it is you've got this thing, it looks like an old radar, the little round display that you'd see the blips and the swirly arm thing on. And you're in the middle, and then you're calculating the movement of all of the other guys as they sort of come into your field of attention.
Right.
So it's not an absolute kind of movement where I'm plotting everybody on a map. It's what you see in the shows where shit just flies at you and flies by. It plays out like that. They're not simulating the reality of what it would be like in a mech. They're simulating how the shows are done. And it's the same thing with results. Like when I'm rolling dice, I'm getting numbers, but those numbers are translating into effects. And there's different effects for the scene. Like they comes at little stickers that you can put on a D6 dice that change it from numbers to what it translates. And one of my favorite is one of the results is "Ah!" And you can roll that on a dice if you're playing the Gundam role-playing game. And
that would be a critical failure.
It is, and if you've ever seen like any kind of Japanese robot show, you know what that means. That's the scream you make before the screen turns red. You get those action streaky lines and your mech blows up.
Yeah.
So the game, it's rules light, and it's trying really hard to simulate not the reality of the events in the game, but the reality of the genre that the game is set in. And And the Japanese also have this weird habit that they explain the mechanics a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And any given page of, because I've seen a few different Japanese role-playing games. Half of the page is the actual rule, and the other half is the designer apologizing for it. it's hard to explain. It is like they're very very conciliatory about how the mechanics work and the shortcomings of the system, and it's odd. I guess that's the only way I can explain it.
Yeah, well, Japanese role-playing games are very odd. I haven't really read enough of them to have too much of an opinion. I've read 2 or 3 of them, and yeah, I've got a copy. My friend Graham gave me a copy of the Japanese-made role-playing game. That's a translated one you can get. That's an interesting book. It's actually you're supposed to be basically playing the maids of a rich NPC. And you're basically his maid harem, pretty much. You'd have to see it to actually understand, but and then you end up fighting amongst yourselves and going on missions and doing stuff. But it's all basically comes back to trying to win your master's favor, basically. But you have some of you are have demon superpowers, and they're superpowered cyborg maids, and there's all because each of you are all these different archetypes. So it's really weird. But again, as Don said, it's mostly about just simulating the feel. But speaking of which, I want to go back to that idea though that I presented, the idea that rules light games are better for non-gamers, and my quintessential example of that would of course be the World of Darkness stuff. Vampire the Masquerade took off in a big way among non-gamers exactly because they took the mechanics and they coded it down into something that was very rules light-ish that normal people could understand very simply, that everything was simply based on a rating of 1 to 5 stars basically, and that's how everything worked and in abstract. And it's oh, okay, and your average person could get that. And because your average person could get that, it brought in a huge number of people who would never consider playing a role-playing game.
So here was the interesting aspect. I didn't care for the Storyteller series, and you'd think I would because that would be right up my alley. And the reason I can, thinking back now, the reason why I didn't like it was the worlds, even though the systems to play them were a lot more simplified, the worlds themselves were ridiculously defined. And so from a perspective of people walking in, basically there's a whole bunch of lore that you kind of needed to know if you were a vampire. There's, you know what I mean? You needed to know what your clan you were with or something like that. If you were even running the mage campaign, which was my favorite of the two, just because I would like the way they dealt with magic, and you guys talked about that in a recent episode as well. That was my favorite of the series, but even that you had to have deeper understanding of exactly what spell casting was about. So even though you can argue that a simpler system works for them, not if you have to spend a lot of time reading, basically novels worth of background information just to play the game. It's not something that you just walk into the same way.
Well, I would argue that's not quite true. The original Vampire the Masquerade game, the players were meant to start off as a bunch of newbie vampires who just woke up and would basically have some more mature vampire, in theory, start acting as their guide and explaining the whole world of Vampire the Masquerade to them. In theory, that's how the game was meant to be played, originally anyway. And so only the GM really had to know all the lore and everything, and the players would get it as they went along. Now, of course, later they added books and books and books and books and books of details because that's how they made their money, and I'm not going to throw stones there. But again, the point is that if you play it in that way, from the newbie vampire or newbie werewolf or whatever coming into the clan and all that stuff, it's totally workable. I would argue it's games like Changeling and Mage, that's where things kind of, and Wraith, where things kind of go off the rails, where that becomes much harder to explain to an average person, and you really do have to understand a lot of background. And
I would say you're probably right, because I think I didn't come up to it till about the second edition of those games. That being said, if you kind of almost are looking for a bunch of newbies to play with, because if you've got somebody who's played the game before, then you've got a real unbalance of how the world works compared to people who don't know in that respect. Whereas it doesn't really matter in D&D to the same degree how the world works, true. Because it's not that kind of game in that respect. So
yeah, I think you're both right. And there's kind of because there's an extra component to it.
Mm-hmm.
The mechanics were simple. The story was the focus. So they had more detailed backgrounds to begin with, but kind of like Rob was getting at, all of them are pretty straightforward when you get to, say, the first book or the first couple of books. It's easy to follow the story, but because that nominally they were focused on the drama as opposed to the event, the fight scene and that, they started fleshing out the backgrounds more and more. And that's where you get into like what Jack is talking about, because they would put out books, and this was my complaint with it, because this was what you started seeing at the early and mid days of the big narrativist role-playing game takeover, was they do like, say, Vampire. And Vampire would be, here's the background, here's the rough history, here's how the different clans of Vampire work. And I'm like, okay, this is cool. And then they would do like specific books for each clan that would detail their history. And you're like, okay, this is still pretty cool. And then they do like specific books for like, say, specific cities. You'd get like the Boston book, and here's all the vampires in Boston. You're like, okay, it's interesting, but at that point you're kind of losing me, because as game master I can come up with my own story. But because they're focusing on the story, they're doing like Rob said. That's how they make their money. They're getting more and more detailed. And eventually it get down to the part where it's like, this is the book of Bob. Bob lives at this address. He likes to have cornflake and like, holy crap, I don't need to memorize all of your Anne Ricean characters. I can make up my own. And that was kind of, the mechanics were simple, but the story got complicated. Out of that, when you get to the early 2000s, you get kind of a thing that, again, I think is overall good and kind of bad, where the narrativist game template changes, because WoD was the original one. They were focusing on the characters and the drama, but still simulating those within the game world. So adding more of that to the game world became the thing. But you got games where the goal was to play the story as opposed to to just the events of the story.
BattleTech was like that too, you know.
Yeah,
it got that way after a while. You know, it just got so involved with, okay, so you got your 4 houses. That's great. Well, now you've got all these clans that are going on, and they've each got their own source book, and eventually you're just like, this is getting exhausting to try to keep up with the lore that you're creating for this world. So. Yeah,
not just that, but you also had GURPS level super detailed mechanics that you had to learn. So, but you got into a thing where they split the difference, and this is where, like, say, the idea of Cosmic Patrol comes in, that I'm not just playing my character, I'm playing the story, that as a participant, I can affect the outcome, and that was the idea by earning and spending plot points.
Right.
I can spend a plot point and totally change the events. Or when you get to stuff like, I'm thinking Fate kind of falls in this category. My ever favorite Cartoon Action Hour season 3, where you're literally playing the story more than the character. That the game is kind of, it's the writer's room of a TV show, except with a few mechanics added in that let us, again, keep track and have a bit of more structure than a straight-up writer's room would for how this story turns out. And that, again, I think broaches to the Baron Munchausen game.
I was going to say, that sounds very Baron Munchausen, actually.
It is, and that's why I say it is a role-playing game. It's a weird, different, fairly unique kind of role-playing game, because I'm not playing even a named character as a participant in a specific story. I'm kind of, it's like Jack said, it's more like an acting exercise with a little bit more structure than maybe you'd have, but I still think that counts, because I'm a guy making up a story, and that's ultimately what any role-playing game is.
True. Very true.
Hmm.
Okay. So was there anything else you want to discuss, Don?
Yeah, there's one of the weird things, because what made me start thinking about all of this was I managed to snag a copy of the Shadowrun 5th edition rulebook.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anybody's ever seen this. This is, in the words of Beavis and Butthead, if you squash a bug with this book, it stays squashed.
Right.
It's this like giant 600-page hardcover book.
Wow.
Wasn't it like a Kickstarter campaign book or something like that?
It was, but I mean, it's there's a lot of role-playing games that have gone that way. That because I ordered a couple, and the package arrives with those warning heavy load stickers all over it. It was basically just 3 books that I'd ordered, but they're these huge like monsters, and I thought it was great because I like Shadowrun, and I was curious about the new version. I heard good things, and I managed to find like an affordable secondhand copy of the damn thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading it, and it's got all kinds of new stuff, and it's cool, and it's fun, and I like messing with the rules, and I like the ideas. And I kind of started feeling bad because I realized there are a lot of people in the world that would never get to enjoy this just because they would look at that and go, holy crap, what is that? Is it, did part of your house fall off? Like, do you have to prop up the launch pad for the space shuttle? Like, Jesus, it's like I'm back in school, and that made me sad because there's a joy to that complexity and such as a feeling of accomplishment when you get to the end, but it's not all work because it's this weird gaming kind of setting.
Right.
So do you think the complexity is now back to being limited to the nerds, but the storytelling narrative style is more open for more people?
From what I've seen, I think you had what happened years ago with video games, where video games had another upsurge, and then like the older players would bitch and moan about like, you know, the Johnny-come-lately gamer types that are just kind of farting around and they're not serious gamers like us.
Posers.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I think role-playing game has a bit of that, but it's not the obsessiveness that there's a lot of games that you could think of as an introductory one that are stripped down, that are conceptually simpler, that are mechanically simpler, and they exist perfectly well these days alongside the 1,200-page giant monster games that require a degree in physics just to be able to like read the formulas for calculating how much your character can lift, you know.
Comes with calculator in box.
Yeah. And again, I think that's valuable because I think what that does is it lets role-playing games be a whole bunch of different things. And because if I go to like a drive-through RPG, which I probably shouldn't because I have way too many. I buy binders by the crate now.
Yep.
because of them. But you'll go down the list and you'll see games like they did. Oh shoot, it's like your magical girl game. I forget what it's called. There's a derivation called Lasers and Feelings.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but okay, I'll look it up.
It's a role playing game. It's like the it's essentially like the shoujo cartoon science fiction game, and it's like 3 pages. And the amazing thing is, it's 3 pages that covers the genre really well, and that's existing alongside like Shadowrun 5. Oh my god, I hope you're ready to go back to college. And they exist perfectly well. I don't see a lot of the bitching about which one is better online, and I don't see people carrying the banner for more rules or less rules. It's just that whatever your shtick is, it's out there and you can partake freely.
Well, I think that the issue is in the modern age is that people aren't expecting it to be a home run like D&D. Back in the day, when you couldn't find certain stuff, or people were, it was really difficult to find. You were finding Dungeons & Dragons books in your local bookstore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So now we've gotten to the point that we can have a lot more niche, just like with comics, just like with everything. We have the ability to be able to say, yeah, I really do enjoy crunchy role-playing games, and so does all these other people around the world, and we can all find each other at Drive-In RPG and get the ones that we want that way. So
That's true.
because it's the trade-off that you see in the internet age, that back in the day, if I did a role-playing game, it had to be a hit. Like,
Yeah.
if I printed a 500-page rule book, that cost me a lot to get those, even if I had a minimum run of, say, 500 copies.
Mm-hmm.
That was probably a fair chunk of change, and I had to move them. Whereas nowadays, since everything's gone digital, especially gaming, most new role-playing games come out as digital and or print on demand.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I can put it together, put it online, and I don't give a shit if it sells at all.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't cost. Like, when I put the Urban Warlords rules up, I didn't have any advertising or that, and it's all there. It doesn't have illustrations or nothing. It's kind of the beta version of the book, and I made $10.
There you go.
And I made $10 free and clear because I didn't have to pay for printing, shipping, or warehousing.
Right.
Yep, no, it's pretty awesome that way.
Yeah, so you can get that variety. The only disadvantage is it makes it harder to make a career of it.
Yes.
Because even if you break in and become a known name, because the audience is so diffused, you're not going to have the income that you, as a B-list gamer, that you'd have, say, in the 80s, as a B-list gamer that was selling actual, X number of copies, because the audience wasn't as broken up.
Is this sort of like ebooks where you want more as opposed to less? So if you're an ebook writer and you write, sort of a particular genre that just a few people like, but you write 12 books of them, 4 trilogies, you're going to do a whole lot better than if you just put out 1 or 2 of those things, because you're not looking for that one big hit. You're looking for your smaller group to just be voracious fans of your stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's different because, like, say for gaming, back in the days, it was a push system.
Right.
That if I got in writing with one of, like, say, the 5 or 10, like, known companies, depending on what era it was, they would push my product. That it would come out. They already had systems, like a lot of gaming companies had a house organ, like TSR had Dragon. GDW had Challenge Magazine.
Right.
That tended to focus more on the company products, if not strictly the company products. And because the audience wasn't as diverse, they were all seeing the same ads. So it was you could push something on, whereas now I could do a huge ad campaign that people who've never heard of me are never going to see, because they're never going to move in a circle where that comes up. And again, it makes it harder to generate that big audience, but a lot easier to generate an audience.
Right.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, the game you're talking about Magical Girls was called Love and Justice.
Yeah, that's it.
And it's
and
it's based on Lasers and Feelings, which apparently Lasers and Feelings, I do remember I encountered that before, is literally like a 2-page role-playing game. As rules light goes, it's pretty light.
Yeah, they're in my pile here somewhere, but I'm not going to go through the possibly thousands of books, because they'll fall on me, and you guys will get to hear me suffocate to death on air, and I don't know if anybody wants that.
When you said binders and then you said girls, I thought you were talking about Mitt Romney's Binders of Women, and thought suddenly Mitt Romney is a nerd and he's been playing role-playing games all this time, but no.
Binders of Women. No.
Didn't you know about that as Binders of Women?
I remember, I've got Binders of Women here. I'm right. Old. I remember that, yep.
There you go.
But yeah, okay, well, the Lasers and Feelings thing, wow, that's super rules light.
And it works. Like, I've never had a chance to run it, but you totally could.
Yep.
Again, if you had the right group.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Like, the typical gamers are not going to get into the shoujo feel. Okay, the surprisingly handsome villain shows up and he winks at you and says, "You're cuter than I thought you'd be." What do? I open up my atomic blaster cannon and blow him into pieces! How much XP do I get? Yeah, they're not going to kind of get into the... And the mechanics aren't set up to enforce that. Like I said, again, it's that idea that they assume you're already and it's hard to enforce anything in like 2 pages.
Well, just like Lasers and Feelings is actually a Star Trek role-playing game.
Is it?
Yeah, that's what Lasers and Feelings actually is. For everyone, I will link to Lasers and Feelings, which is a completely free 2-page game. You can get it as a PDF online. I'll link to it in the show notes, and also link to Love and Justice, which actually is also free. It's on DriveThruRPG. It just happens to be through DriveThruRPG, but you can download a free PDF of it. And in fact, it looks like people have gone through and they call them Lasers and Feelings hacks. There's one where it's a role playing game set in the Roman Empire, and it's using the basic rules from Lasers and Feelings. There's another one, it's a superhero one called Tights and Fights. Oh, wait, no, sorry, that's not superhero, it's wrestling. Sorry, that's wrestling. Okay. Starships and Scoundrels. Teachers and Tentacles.
Eep.
Oh, okay, anyway, we're going to move on. Deputies and Desperados, there we go. There's a D&D one.
I wonder what that's called.
They call it Dungeons with Dragons.
Oh. Okay.
I thought they were going to say Dungeons and Damsels. There you go.
Now
nobody make
with
that.
Dragons.
Yeah, because that's a great title. I'm going to use that one somewhere down the line.
Jack calls it. Yeah.
There you go. Called it. Yeah. Shotgun.
And there's lots of them here, and because the thing with the Lasers with Feelings thing is they're literally meant to be 2-3 page RPGs. And the whole idea is it's very, very simple rules-wise. Like, it basically is only really a step above a group of kids playing Let's Pretend. Because most of the rules are just about setting up the scenario. They're not even about actually playing.
And that kind of goes back to the beginning, like when you got White Box D&D, that it was pretty basic. And anybody who partook had their own take on it.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of what you're seeing there. Like I say, there's other stripped down systems. Fate was like that there's 100 million different, because everybody would do their own kind of take on it. And the weird thing is, going with my idea that whatever your shtick is, you can have it. It goes the other way, that the D20 Modern game that they did, that in and of itself wasn't super popular, has 100 bajillion third party guys who just did their own version for their own genres and their own stories and just ran with it. And there was like 1 billion variants of it.
All right, then. So on that note, I think we're going to bring this episode to a close, unless there's anything else we want to cover. I mean, after Lasers and Feelings, where can we go from there?
That's true.
So thanks, Jack, for coming and visiting with us once more and talking about rules heavy versus rules light role-playing games.
Thanks for having me, guys. Always fun.
Yep. Thanks, Don, for keeping us on course and organized as usual, even though it was a difficult time.
Hurt those cats.
And thank you, listener, for sticking with us through this long and rambling podcast about hard and soft role-playing games, and hopefully you didn't snicker too much. Good night, everyone. Check out obeythedna.com. Leave comment or check out the show notes. And good night. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!